All right, so one more time. Hi, my name's Janelle Ware. I'm the horticulture educator serving Marathon and Wood counties for Extension. And tonight we are going to talk about insect management. And so before we get going, I just want to mention real briefly, explain some of the handouts that I sent with the links to tonight's recording or to tonight's program. So the first set of the first handout is a graphic organizer. You can think of a graphic organizers like what the kids these days are calling worksheets. The idea behind this is just to help direct you as you're taking notes through the program, help direct you to the things that I really feel are the most important. However, if you've got your own way of taking notes, I'm one that anytime I'm on the phone or listening to anybody, I got to have a pen in my hand. It's just part of my process of listening. If you're like that and you've got your own process, that works too. You don't have to use this. This is just kind of, an added thing. Hopefully it'll help you. The other thing I have is a comprehensive notes. Again, with the comprehensive notes, this is basically all of my notes. And so go ahead and feel free to take your notes however you want. You can think of this as this is your safety net, okay? So if there's something later on and you're wondering, oh, what did she say about that topic? It's probably going to be in here because, like I said, these are literally just my notes. As far as the resources for this week, I will drop in some resources in here in the next couple of days. I just didn't get a chance to drop those in yet. So come back for more supplemental materials if there's anything that you want to read more about. Okay, so on that note, we will go ahead and jump right into tonight's program. So tonight we are going to talk about insect development. Really, we're going to be talking about life cycles. And then we're going to talk about the actual damage that the insects do. Really what we're getting at there is their mouth parts. Do they have chewing mouth parts or do they have sucking mouth parts? And what can we learn about that damage as far as how to manage these pests? And then we're going to briefly touch on beneficial insects and pest management and some things that I think would be important for you to kind of keep in mind and think about. So why don't we kind of, just to get the juices going and our thinking caps on, why don't you go ahead and name an insect that if you have battled an insect in the past, name it and what did you do about it? And were you successful? And then finally, what did success mean? What does success look like if you're successful? Any thoughts? Feel free to unmute yourself or drop it right in the chat. So we've got one response, worms. And Corey says that he lost the battle with the worms. I'm going to guess we're talking about like cabbage worms or something like that. Like some sort of larvae that ate the leaves, possibly. Although with jumping worms, it could be invasive earthworms too. I've got a story to share. So this one's not really vegetable related, but it's insects. And I don't know if the moral of my story is going to be helpful or not, but when I came up with this question, the answer for me personally that came to mind was the scarlet lily beetle. So along the south side of my house, I used to have a whole stretch of beautiful Asiatic and Oriental lilies. And I want to say maybe it was about 5 years ago. And I was familiar. I knew that they were coming. About 5 years ago, I was the first time that I had them, and they just devastated my lilies. And so, and it was quick. It was really, really quick. Now, a caveat to the story is the south side of my house just happens to be a part of my yard that I don't necessarily walk by on a regular basis. I have to make a point to go out of my way to go walk around that side of the house. I think if I would have been more actively watching them, it may not have been as bad. But so first year, they just decimate my plants and I was devastated. No flowers that year. Second year, thought, okay, I need to keep on top of this a little, much more closely. And they were so quick to devastate my lilies. You really need to stay on top of them and look at them, at least once a day. And I probably let like 2 or 3 days go in between looking at them. And it was amazing the level of devastation that they presented. So at that point, my way of handling them, because I often call myself the lazy gardener, my way of handling it, and this is based off of, my personal motivations for growing things. Time is something that I'm more limited, and probably even more so back then because my children were smaller. So for me, the best option was not going to be to go out there and hand pick them as often as I would need to, especially for the amount of lilies that I had. For me, the best mode was just to go ahead and replace my lilies with irises, which that's what I've got now. And it's funny because it's been, I want to say that like at least 5 years since I pulled all of my lilies, and I still have lily leaf beetles in the ground where the lilies used to be. So I think maybe for my sanity's sake, and sanity is probably one of the biggest motivators of why I garden. So for my sanity's sake, I think maybe it might have been a good option to go ahead and just remove the pest and the host plant. Or I guess I didn't remove the pest, but remove the host plant altogether. So for me, success was not having to struggle with them anymore. Like I said, don't know if the moral of the story is going to be helpful or not. All right. Well, now that we're kind of thinking about pests and thinking about, different what success means, let's go ahead and jump right into life cycles. So when insects develop through gradual metamorphosis, the immature insects are going to look just like the adults. So here, perfect example, we've got a couple of baby grasshoppers, and what do you know? They're going to look very similar to an adult grasshopper, right? So insects that develop through gradual metamorphosis, they hatch from an egg into the nymph stage, and then they'll gradually develop into their adult state by shedding their exoskeleton several times. Now, the reason why this is important to kind of be aware of or know is that the juveniles, the youth, are going to look similar. So that means they're going to have the same types of mouth parts, and they're going to eat the same types of foods that they're going to eat when they become adults. Really, the biggest difference between the juveniles and the adults is just a matter of sexual maturity. And if it's the type of insect that will get wings eventually, it's not until like that's the point that you know that it's at its adult stage. Otherwise, they look pretty similar. The juveniles look similar to the adults. So some examples of insects that go through gradual metamorphosis are going to be your grasshoppers, your crickets, earwigs, aphids, scales, mealybugs, and thrips. So all of those are going to be ones that develop gradually. On the other hand, we've got complete metamorphosis. So for insects that undergo complete metamorphosis, the immature will look very different, completely different than the adults. So here we've got sawfly larvae. I lost my cursor. There we go. So here we've got a sawfly larvae, and you can see it does not look anything like what its parents look like, right? It doesn't look anything at all like the adults. So insect development with a complete metamorphosis are going to have 4 distinct life stages. You'll have your egg stage, you'll have your larvae stage, your pupa stage, and then finally the adult. So why does this matter? Well, the youth And the adults, they live in different environments. You think about this guy right here, right? This is the sawfly larvae, no wings. So he's spending all of his time crawling around on leaves, and he eats leaves, okay? Over here, we've got our sawfly, the adult. He looks like an adult, right? I'm not positive what sawflies eat, but I'm going to guess it's probably organic matter. All right, so they're not going to be chomping on the living leaves. So some examples of insects that undergo complete metamorphosis are going to be your beetles, your butterflies. Butterflies are the classic, right? Moths too, but also your flies, your mosquitoes, sawflies, ants, and bees. So all of them will have, as including, there's a lot more insects too, but these are some good examples. So understanding the life cycle will help determine the best timing to implement management strategies and which strategies are most effective. So you may remember this is our pest management triangle, and we're going to start at the bottom and work our way through the framework of making decisions. All right. So you may remember the very bottom, the foundation of pest management is knowledge. So you're going to go around and you're going to gather information about your host plant. You'll gather some information about the susceptible pests, so diseases that the plant is susceptible to, insects that the plant's susceptible to, perhaps even large wildlife. So I'm thinking like mammal pests or birds. That's going to be really important to know. As well as the surrounding environment. And then as you're doing that, you're going to be kind of reflecting and making some decisions on how much damage you're willing to tolerate. And you may remember a discussion at the last session where we talked about some of those personal decisions. You know, there's no right or wrong answer to these. These are personal decisions. So they'll be things like, what is motivating you to garden? If you're gardening to feed your family, well, then you may not be able to tolerate as much damage as, say, me, who is gardening just to gardening for those therapeutic purposes, gardening for my mental health, gardening for my sanity, right? So if I'm gardening for my sanity, I can go ahead and let my lilies go, right? Or perhaps I can let, some other pest. I'm willing to tolerate more damage because of that. So personal decisions, personal reflections. Next, you monitor. You're keeping your eye out, looking for that activity. And then once you've noticed that, oh, yeah, we definitely have some activity, and the activity is at enough, the insect population has crossed a threshold in which we need to go ahead and take some sort of action. Once we've crossed that threshold, and we made that decision of where that threshold was a while back, right? When we were kind of gathering all of our information. So once we've crossed that threshold, now we know we need to go ahead and employ our control measures. And we're going to utilize all of the options that are available to us. So we're going to probably use quite a few control measures. We may use some biological measures, depending on what the pest is and what our options are. Probably going to be using some mechanical. So that's going to be, maybe going out there and just plucking the egg masses off of the plants. And then finally, after we've employed everything else, we will follow up with a chemical. Perhaps we would follow up with a chemical option, a chemical control method. And then just keeping in mind that we want to use the least toxic method. And that's going to be toxic not only to ourselves, but the environment around us. So the benefit of using this strategy is by following this, it's just going to be it just happens. It just naturally will be that you'll be reducing The opportunities of unintended consequences, meaning death, to beneficial insects that might occur if we were just going to go straight for those non-selective insecticides. Okay, so I'm not necessarily arguing against using pesticides. I'm arguing for using effective. If we do need to reach that as a last resort, I'm arguing for effective use. Okay, so let's do a case study. This time around, I don't have a fun story to go along with our case study. We are just going to dig into cabbage maggots. And just so you know, you're going to see in the next couple of slides, I have pulled out some specific information that I want you to kind of read through. So it's coming from this fact sheet. This is a UW-Madison Extension fact sheet on cabbage maggots. So I thought it would be fun for us to kind of work through some of the stuff that I just talked about using an actual real life situation. So we've got our cabbage maggots here. This is what they look like. This is the larval stage, and this is what the adults look like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to pause the recording and I'm going to be quiet for 2 minutes. And I'm going to go ahead and let you read through that. And then when you're all finished, go ahead and answer this question in the chat. And so the question is, what type of metamorphosis do cabbage maggots do? So you go ahead and read and I'll be quiet and pause the recording. All right, so I see we've got one answer. Again, that question is, what type of metamorphosis? So we've got one answer with complete metamorphosis. Anybody disagree? No, it's complete metamorphosis. Yeah. So if we remember, if we go back, gradual metamorphosis is when the juveniles look like the adults. Complete metamorphosis is when they look very, very different. And here, thinking about this, yeah, they definitely go through a complete metamorphosis. All right, next one, I'll let you read through this. And actually, before we do that, I kind of want to back up. So with that complete metamorphosis, what do you think that means for the things that they eat and the damage they do? Do you think that the adults are doing the same damage that the youth are doing? What do we think? So if we look, we know that the adults overwinter, and the overwinter is pupae, and then they emerge in mid-May. So about the same time that yellow rocket and the forsythias are in bloom, about a couple weeks ago. And they love that fresh tilled fields with our decaying organic matter. They really, really, especially if the farmers are manuring the fields, that's what they're going after. So the adults are going after the manure in the fields or the organic material, that beautiful compost that you added to your garden. That's what the adults are going after. So the adults will mate. And then they will lay their eggs in the soil. And then the eggs, after they hatch, you've got the larvae that starts eating the cole crop roots. And so that's where they become so damaging to us. We don't really mind the adults flying around in the compost. That's not really the problem. The problem is them getting into the roots. All right. I'm going to pause the recording and be quiet for a couple of minutes, and I'll let you read through this next one. And when you're all finished reading with that, go ahead and Share in the chat, or you could always unmute yourself too. What are the suggested control methods? There's a little theme that I'm hoping kind of we can pull out of this as we're reading through it. So again, I'm going to pause the recording and be quiet for a moment, and you go ahead and read that and kind of think about go ahead and think about and share in the chat. What are those suggested control methods? Okay, so some of the ones that I came up with, actually, let me back up for a moment. So in the chat, we've got a few control methods that they mentioned. So soil temperature, the timing of the planting, not planting after fresh manure spreading, because those adults, that's what's going to attract the adults, right? Let's see, some other ones that I have is so there's the timing of the planting, but there's also that timing of if you used a cover crop and you're going to till that under as a green manure, there's the timing of that too, right? So I think they gave you like about 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks to give it about 2 to 3 weeks in between tilling before you plant any transplants in there or any seeds. They also mention floating row covers. They mention a couple of biological things, so parasitic nematodes and ground beetles, as well as diatomaceous earth. That would be more like a pesticide. And then they do mention that if you are going to use insecticides, again, timing, you want those insecticides at planting, right? So the big theme that I hope kind of carried through in there is the idea of timing is so important. The timing of the cultural methods as well as the chemicals, right? Both of those, for them to be the most effective, you got to time it. And that timing piece is all about its life cycle. All right. So, well, besides perhaps even with the floating row cover, you've got to catch that timing correctly too. So, yeah, with all of these, it's really important to just kind of be aware of, and you need to know about the pest and the pest's life cycle to know that you need to get that timing just right. All right, so that was life cycles. Now we're going to switch gears over to insect damage, okay? And so now what we're going to talk about is mouth parts. Really, that's what it comes down to. So insects with chewing mouth parts eat leaves, they damage the fruit, they prune plant roots, or they bore into plant stems or wood. Okay, so all of those are going to have those chewing mouth parts. So there's some different ways that we see this damage happen though. Okay, so the first one we've got here, I've got a white cabbage plant, believe it or not, that used to be a white cabbage plant that was totally defoliated. So when you've got defoliation, what happens is there's a removal of the leaf tissue or complete leaf loss. All right. So that's going to be a little bit different than skeletonizing. So this is going to be more along the lines of skeletonizing. When insects damage is skeletonizing, then they'll eat the leaf blade, but they're going to leave the leaf veins intact. One big one that we see here in central Wisconsin quite a bit that skeletonizes the leaves are going to be Japanese beetles. Japanese beetles will definitely do that. Next, we've got leaf mining. So this is a tomato leaf. When I think of leaf miners, what comes to mind is columbine. Darn near every columbine leaf in about a week or two is going to have some sort of leaf miner action on it. It seems, maybe it's not true, but it sure seems that way. Columbine is just a perennial flower, a native perennial flower. Leaf miners, they're insects that feed between the upper and the lower leaf blade, and they leave this discolored, it's kind of serpentine trail behind, and it's because all of the tissue between the top and the bottom layers of the leaves have been eaten. Um, and then finally, we've got your girdling insects. Those are not fun either. So girdling are going to be your borers, B-O-R-E-R-S. So that's going to be your, or I'm sorry. So those are going to be your borers. You can either have herbaceous borers like this guy over here. This is a squash vine borer, but there are insects that will bore into trees as well. So if you're not familiar, there's a real devastating insect that is taking out ash trees called the emerald ash borer. So borers with those chewing mouth parts, they can do quite a bit of damage. And there's a lot that they can get through. So some examples of your insects with chewing mouth parts are going to be your beetles, your crickets and grasshoppers, caterpillars, certainly. You think about all the damage that caterpillars do when they defoliate our vegetable plants. Sawflies, and here I'm thinking of that sawfly larvae, webworms, and maggots. All of these are common examples of insects that cause injury by chewing mouth parts. And then you got your suckers. So insects with sucking mouth parts feed with a needle-like mouth parts, and they suck the juices out of either the plants or animals. So animals, you think about mosquitoes, right? Females mosquitoes, they use that needle-like mouth part to inject right inside of our skin and then pull some blood out. So that would be an example of those sucking mouth parts. The type of damage that you can expect is going to be deformed fruit and foliage. That might be burned. That fruit might be burned, or the leaves. Actually, the foliage might have like a little bit of a burn look to it, or maybe some speckled tissue. Sometimes when they inject their mouth parts in to suck the juices out, they might be injecting something into some sort of toxin to the plants too. Let's see. One thing to keep in mind. So if you were with us at the last session, we talked about cucumber beetles, and the secondary damage of cucumber beetles is they carry bacterial wilt. So those cucumber beetles, they have chewing mouth parts, and some insects with chewing mouth parts will spread diseases. But by and large, the majority of your plant diseases are transmitted by insects are going to be transmitted by insects with sucking mouth parts. So something else to kind of keep an eye out for. Let's see. Oh, one thing to keep in mind too is not only do bad bugs have these sucking mouth parts, but a lot of your good bugs do too. So how I mentioned mosquito, and the mosquito will suck our juices from us. There are some predatory and there's some predatory insects, and they prey on other insects that have these mouth parts too, these sucking mouth parts. And what they'll do is suck all the juice out of they'll suck all the juice out of the other insect. So examples of some insects that have sucking mouth parts are going to be your aphids, scale insects do, plant bugs, mealy bugs, and of course, mosquitoes. So here we've got a squash bug, and the squash bug is sucking all of the juices out, and you can see this damage that it's leaving behind. Aphids are another one that'll produce real similar damage. So learning the damage caused by each type of mouth part can help you determine the technique that'll be most effective in the management. So insects with chewing mouth parts, they can be selectively controlled by some certain types of insecticides that are applied directly to the plant surfaces, and they're only effective if they're ingested, if the insect actually eats it. Contact alone, just crawling on the leaf, isn't going to be enough. Okay, so an example of this would be spinosad. So I'm going to use spinosad in bees, and let's talk about green beans for an example. All right. So let's say that the Japanese beetles are eating my green beans and they just won't leave them alone. And perhaps I'm out there and I'm picking them and I'm doing everything I can, but I need just a little bit of extra help here. So I decide to use a spray, and I find this great selective spray called spinosad. And I'll go ahead and just drop, because a lot of people like when I start talking about spinosad, people get curious. This is an active ingredient. You'll find it under lots of different brand names or trade names. So spinosad, it was discovered in a rum distillery in the Caribbean, actually. It's just a bacteria, but it happens to be very toxic to the guts of certain types of insects. Not all insects. That's kind of one of the cool things about it is very selective, does a great job on thrips in the beetle family, doesn't do a darn thing for aphids. So you would want to make sure, number one, since it is selective insecticide, is it going to be effective on the type of insect that you're going after? But getting back to that idea of contact and being selective, if with my green beans, and if they're covered in these Japanese beetles, I could spray them. And once the leaves become dry, they are not going to be toxic on contact. That bacteria needs to be inside of the gut of the insect for it to do any damage to the insect. So the beauty here is we spray our green beans, we let it dry, and we try to be really mindful not to spray when we know that the bees are going to be active. Once it's dry, it's non-toxic to bees. So kind of something to kind of keep in mind. The moral of this story is, again, we can be really selective and in controlling our insects with our pesticides. Okay, so I've got another case study for us. This time we're going to talk about the diamondback moth. And again, I'm taking you'll see that, like, the screenshots, I'm taking that from an extension fact sheet on the diamondback moth. So here's what it looks like. And it'll start in the larvae stage. I'm going to go ahead and we'll do this one more time. I think this is the last time. I'm going to be quiet and pause the recording, let you have some time to kind of think about, or let you have some time to read through this. And I'm going to drop a question inside the chat for you to think about. Go ahead and drop the answer when you see it. The question is, what does it say about resistance? So our question was, what does it say about resistance? One of our answers is, sounds like the moth is resistant to many different types of insecticides. May have to try more physical methods of removal. Yeah. So, my next question, because it mentions, it's resistant to a lot of pesticides. BT still seems like it's working in Wisconsin, but it's become resistant in other areas, right? So if we really want to keep this as our silver bullet in our back pocket, we probably don't want to use it for everything, or use it as our only method to avoid this pest, right? So my follow-up question was going to be, why is it important to use cultural and chemical controls and not just rely on chemical controls? Kind of getting right at it there, if we keep using, if we only rely on that chemical control, number one, the pest is going to end up becoming resistant to it. We've seen evidence that it does it in other areas, right? We don't want that to happen. And so we want to save it for extreme situations and not just use it all the time. Instead, we really want to think about employing as many of these cultural controls as possible. All right. So next, I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about beneficial insects. So most insects are beneficial. And what we've got here is, this is a parasitic wasp. All right. And actually, I didn't notice this before, but I think those are her babies next to her, or eggs next to her. So this is a parasitic wasp. I'm not positive on that though. This is a parasitic wasp. And over here we've got a tomato hornworm. This little horn is almost covered up in these wasp eggs. But what happens is this parasitic wasp will go and lay her eggs on the tomato hornworm, and they'll make use of the hornworm real quick. Um, they infect the tomato hornworm and then use that as food while they're developing. So one thing I kind of wanted to just show you is, you may not recognize this guy flying around in the garden as being a beneficial insect, right? Not all of our beneficial insects are going to be pollinators, right? There's other types of beneficial insects. These guys are good guys because they get rid of the bad guys. So I want to kind of keep in mind, keep that space to be able, when you see insects, kind of lean towards, chances are, and this is true, chances are by far and large, the majority of insects don't do any damage at all. And even the ones that do become pests, even they can be beneficial to us. So here I've got a multicolored Asian lady beetle. She is your friend in the garden if you've got an aphid problem, because this will eat all of your aphids in short order. But when this guy's population gets to be too large, especially in the fall when those temperatures get cool, and they start to go to the south side of your house and crawl up in the siding trying to find a way inside your house, that's when it becomes a pest, right? So this guy just hanging out by himself, he's not necessarily a pest. It's when those populations get so large that they become damaging, that's when we really need to start thinking of them as a pest. But in of themselves, they're not necessarily a pest. And then finally for us, I just wanted to kind of bring us back to the IPM framework. So this framework that we keep going through. And this week we're doing insects. I think we've got weeds coming up too. We haven't talked about diseases yet, but we will be talking about diseases. I'm not kidding. All pest issues, if it's got some sort of biotic source, living organism, if it's a living organism and it's a pain in the garden, by going through this series of this framework for making decisions, this will give you the most effective ways to manage that pest. And it's true for insects. Now, the benefit here is this IPM framework. It reduces the consequences of pesticides to beneficial insects. Because we are starting off with learning that knowledge is power. Knowledge is the foundation of our pest management. Learning as much as we can about the host plant, the pest susceptible pests as well as the surrounding area, and then kind of doing some soul searching and deciding what level of damage can I tolerate. And again, like I said, those are going to be personal decisions. There's no right or wrong answer here. But once you've made those decisions and collected that information, you're going to be monitoring for activity. Most likely, that's going to be eyeballs on plants. That's where I went wrong with my lily leaf beetle, is I went way too much time, even though it was only a couple of days. I went too long in between monitoring my plants for pests. So you monitor for that activity. And then once the population has crossed that threshold where you know that there's going to be damage that you're not going to be able to tolerate, then you know it's time to take action. And you're going to do that using control methods. And you're always going to want to work through all of your control methods, starting with your cultural, going into your mechanical. If there's a biological available, there isn't going to be one with all pests, but sometimes there is. Might want to try out some of those biologicals, and then finally reaching for those chemical solutions as a last resort, and then if possible choosing something that's going to be selective. If we choose something selective, we've got a better chance of not accidentally killing somebody who could be an actual friend inside of our garden. Let me just check my notes. So lastly, so I think that just kind of sums it up nicely. By identifying the pest, learning the life cycle, and the way that it causes damage. So is it either going to be through sucking the plant juices out and then causing some wilting because we've destroyed the vascular tissue in the plant, or whether it's just by chewing and defoliating. We can be selective in our management techniques rather than taking a reactive approach with non-selective sprays that could harm some of those beneficial insects that we actually want hanging out inside of our gardens. All right, so wrapping up, definitely always open if you've got an aha moment, something that you hadn't really considered before, go ahead and share that. Or if anything is clear as mud, what's still confusing for you, please feel free to either unmute yourself or drop a question inside the chat. As we finish up tonight, after I close out the program, um, in the browser, there should be a survey for you. That survey will have two different types of questions. The first set of questions are going to be demographics questions. The reason why I'm asking these questions is because I work for UW-Madison, and we're actually required by law to make sure that we're providing all of our programming to everybody in our communities. And so these demographic questions, this is one of the ways that I share with my federal, state, and county partners that I'm doing my best to do that. The second set of questions, oh, and I wanted to let you know they're all anonymous, and prefer not to answer should be one of your choices. So if you don't feel comfortable sharing that information, no problem. I get it. You can go ahead and choose prefer not to answer. The second set of questions are going to be evaluation. I just have 3 quick questions there just to check in and make sure that this was a good use of your time as well as mine. All right. Um, and so I am not seeing any questions inside the chat. Y'all have my email address because that's how you got here tonight with the link. So please feel free to, if you got questions, but they don't come to you until maybe as soon as I hit the leave meeting, or maybe not until 2 in the morning, maybe not until 2 or 3 months from now. Anytime, if you've got questions, horticultural related questions, definitely feel free to drop me an email and ask those questions, and I'll get back to you. All right. Well, on that note, I'll go ahead and give you a couple minutes of your evening back. Thank you so much for spending some time with me this evening and learning a little bit about insect management. Hopefully, I've armed you with some concepts that will help you as we get started in this growing season. Take care. Have a great night.